Hello and welcome to another Facts Matter podcast presented by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, dedicated to the proposition that facts should drive policy, not politics. Today we take a look at a huge phenomenon in our culture right now, and that is online sports betting. In 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a law that prohibited states from engaging in online betting. And that opened the floodgates to 40 states not only setting up shop, but also getting a considerable amount of tax revenue. Now, like any engagement like this, there are problems and there are consequences affecting a small minority of people, but that small minority is concerning. So today, without scolding or without demonizing the online betting culture, we want to take a step back and say, 6 years into this phenomenon, can we do a better job of preventing problem gaming and also addressing it and treating it? We're bringing in Karley Abramson, who's Research Associate for Health Policy at the CRC, and you can find her paper at crcmich.org. Karley, hello.
Hi.
So let's just set the stage here. How large is this multi-billion-dollar business?
It is huge, and how much it has grown in such a short period of time, considering it has only been legal in Michigan for the past 6 years. But in Michigan in particular, about half of all men between the ages of 18 and 49 have an online sports betting account. About 22% of all Americans have one. So it is very, very common. It is something that is very culturally accepted and culturally embraced. Even if you aren't a part of the online sports betting culture, you probably are aware of it just because of how prevalent it is in sports. If you are at all interested in sports, you probably have some awareness of the sports betting in industry. And for someone like me, I'm really not, I'm not really in the sports universe, but I was even very aware of how pervasive this industry is. And so, like you said, most people engage in this very responsibly. And, it doesn't lead to these huge issues, but there is a considerable minority of people for which this does negatively impact not only them in, increasing rates of gambling addiction, but then has ripple effects on their families, on their communities. And so it's a public health issue that is worth addressing, considering
they're
so new.
About that.
Yeah.
How is this a health issue? Because somebody's saying, okay, I understand there are social consequences here. There are financial consequences here for people that might get in over their heads. How does this fall under the heading of health policy?
Yeah, so in a couple of different ways. So first of all, there's a lot of research that shows that gambling addiction functions very similarly to other types of addiction, to substances. There's a lot of the same brain processes that happen with that dopamine feedback loop happen in the gambling participation. And so there's a lot of research to show that those increased rates of addiction are very likely, especially considering the ease of access to online sports betting. It's very different than how it used to be or how you kind of engage when you go to a casino or back when back in the olden days where you had to leave your house or go find somebody to participate in this. The ease of access to this kind of fuels how easily it can become addictive for people. So there's that addiction piece, which then has its own ripple effects on, there's a lot of data that shows, what happens in certain communities when there's a large percentage of people who have lost money on online sports bets, the increase in crime in that community, in violence, theft, both community violence and interpersonal violence. And
let's discuss that for a moment, because that was the one I think that jumped out at me in your paper.
Yeah.
Was that those gamblers that get into trouble, that they have a bad streak, they tend to take it out on their family.
Correct.
Or those closest to them, domestic partners.
Right. And so those kind of ramifications of when you're in trouble and there's, a lack of resources. And there is also some indication that very few people who struggle with gambling seek out any resources or help for it. And so they're kind of dealing with the struggle themselves. And so there are a lot of those ripple effects of how they externalize the negative emotions that come with the loss and the stress from gambling loss.
Right. So in this universe, this $5 billion annual business in Michigan, do we know what percentage of participants get into trouble? And of those that we know, do we trust those numbers, or because of the anonymity of it, because you're doing it in the privacy with you and your smartphone,
right?
Do we believe the numbers, or is there a presumption that it's underreported?
There definitely is a presumption that it is underreported. It also depends on how we are diagnostically defining gambling addiction, because there are some people who don't necessarily meet the diagnostic criteria for addiction, but are still engaging in some of those problematic behaviors that have those negative public health consequences. So I don't have Michigan specific numbers, but nationally, it's between, I think, 5 and 20 million Americans have a gambling problem. Now, that's just general. That's beyond online sports betting. However, as we mentioned, the online sports betting is particularly vulnerable because of how easy it is to access. And, for other reasons that we'll probably talk about, there's different features about online sports betting that make it very easy to continue to place bets. There's no natural stopping point. And so there are lots of different features that make it, for people who are vulnerable, that make it even a more vulnerable situation for them.
And it's interesting, the industry itself and lawmakers back in 2019 were very aware that there were going to be social, economic, and perhaps law enforcement consequences to this. It's why they mandated the disclaimer at the end of all the ads saying, if you get into trouble, here's the number to call. But it seemed like during that debate, there was a lot of focus on what the proper tax rate was, rather than on addressing a lot of these problems. So I think it's very timely that we do this now.
Yeah.
What is it about, one of the things that we've witnessed is the growth of prop bets, these little micro bets that are really fun, and they're kind of silly in some ways. It could be, who's going to miss more free throws from the line, or, double fault the most. It could be anything, and some of them are kind of ridiculous. Why are those considered, and I'm going to put this in quotes, hazardous?
Right. So those potentially for a few reasons. One, like I mentioned, they're endless. And so if you have kind of that addictive nature with the dopamine feedback loop of placing a bet, there's really no end to the number of kind of those side bets that you can do. You can also stack them together, and there are lots of different ways to really fuel and feed that dopamine feedback loop. And so their existence of them themselves can be a little bit, quote unquote, hazardous. But there's also other features about, the use of AI and kind of suggested or recommended bets. And so that there's always some kind of suggestion or lead or lure to place another bet based on something that is recommended to you. And so other states have proposed trying to just limit those pieces of it, to try to limit the number of prop bets, to limit the use of AI in the recommended targeted bets, just to try to chip away at some of that, to create a few extra roadblocks or barriers for the people who are most vulnerable.
We noticed that with the advent of debit cards, there was kind of a disconnect. People didn't feel like they were spending money because they didn't actually see the cash leaving their hands as we went to a cashless society. Do we have the same problem with people that can charge their online betting account with their credit card?
Yes, and that's another policy area that we've seen other states discuss and a few other implement, is restricting the use of credit cards in being able to place online bets. So not just credit cards, but just any kind of borrowed money. We've seen other states create regulations around that. So again, that's another kind of small thing that you can add to limit at least how deeply someone could fall into debt, that they're not placing bets on borrowed money, is another one of those policy areas that is something that Michigan could consider to help curb the problem.
And we should point out, some of the online gaming proprietors have already done this, haven't they? I mean, they've tried to act responsibly. No different than casinos looking at people that come in that they can see are losing a lot. They'll raise a yellow flag there. Do we see these online betting concerns also doing that to some extent? Or is it harder for them to do?
I think it's harder to recognize in the online universe is a little bit harder for the entity itself to kind of zero in on where the problem is. And then there's also the question of incentives. And, there's, with how casinos are regulated, there's a little bit of an incentive for casinos to kind of rein in some of that problematic behavior for their own protection, which is not necessarily as present in the online betting universe as well. So I don't really know too much about how they are self-regulating, but as we know, the kind of the relationship between federal or government regulations and how the private industry then chooses to regulate themselves, there's a link there.
Okay, so we've seen other states limit the use of credit cards to fund the online accounts. We've seen them limit the number of prop bets.
Mm-hmm.
But also, does the way we define this, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I want to make sure that we emphasize it, that we have an existing infrastructure here in our health system to address substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Should we use, there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. Should we use that same kind of infrastructure or maybe broaden definitions to include gambling addiction?
Yes, and that's another piece. And it's not that Michigan doesn't have any resources for gambling addiction as is, but there are some areas in which gambling addiction is treated as separate from other types of substance abuse and other types of addictive behavior. And so there is a separate fund that is dedicated for gambling addiction, but making sure that those general resources that are available to anyone who struggles with addiction are also available for gambling addiction, because as I've mentioned, they function very similarly. And so an example in the, insurance industry is that, through Obamacare, other types of substance abuse and addictive treatment is mandated to be covered. Gambling addiction is not included in that. A lot of providers tend to get around this because gambling addiction has, co-occurs with other things that are covered, but making it so that state-run plans and Medicaid have to cover that those types of services, considering the rise in the popularity and then the potential problems that we will see because of how accessible it is and how much it is just embedded in our whole culture.
So in her new budget, Governor Whitmer has proposed a lot of sin taxes, or vice taxes, if you will, an increase in the cigarette tax and things like that, and also is proposing an increase in the tax on online gaming. But do we know, has she earmarked any of those dollars for treatment and prevention of those with gambling problems?
We don't know. And as far as I know, the goal of that is to really kind of raise money for Medicaid and, to try to find pieces and pockets of the budget that you can raise toward
Yeah,
Medicaid.
but it could also offset the Medicaid cost of providing these services to people that get into trouble.
Exactly. And so I don't know. I don't think there's been any statement about that. And we haven't really come out to say whether or not we think it's a good idea to do that. However, if that is going to happen, if there is going to be, this new revenue, then it would make sense to earmark some of it for gambling prevention and treatment. And so to be able to use some of those funds specifically to target a problem that we know is going to continue to grow because of what we've seen in the past 6 years.
It's interesting. Anecdotally, I've been talking to some people about the podcast that we were going to do today. And I talked with one woman who her daughter was involved with a young man. They were considering marriage, but she recognized that he had a problem with online sports betting, had to take a second job to feed that habit. And she ended up ending the relationship over it because she saw the red flags. So
Yeah.
the more I've talked to people about this, the more you realize how pervasive it's become, but also how many different consequences there are to this.
Absolutely.
And we mentioned
Yeah.
bankruptcies, car loan defaults, larcenies, and the domestic violence piece, which I said was really
Absolutely.
stuck out.
And then beyond that, which is a little kind of outside the scope of public health, but the impact on sports integrity is also something that people care a lot about. And we have data to show the rise in harassment of athletes that has happened. And so there's a lot of these other ramifications that are making a certain number of people uncomfortable and kind of inclined to see what else can we do to try to rein it in a little bit so that we can kind of curb some of these problematic branches.
And we should point out that expand a little bit on the athlete harassment piece of this and how it's happening, because that's really seems to be around the prop bet phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some of it is that. So some of that is, and that's a little bit different because then we're talking more about kind of corruption and the sports integrity of athletes potentially.
I think still a lot of it's important to a lot of us who, especially in college sports, who want to keep whatever purity is left in the integrity of the sport. That's a big concern.
Right. Like, so we talked about certain, prop bets in terms of how someone pitches a baseball. And so there's one piece of it where there's the athlete participation, potentially in a potentially corrupt way, or just some kind of problematic way that changes kind of the nature of the game.
Right.
And then there is this separate piece of harassment of just when athletes don't perform the way that they were supposed to. And just that externalizing of those negative emotions that come with the devastating loss of losing a bet is then externalized to the community, to family, and to the athletes themselves.
Right. So we have at least begun the conversation, and it's up to Michigan lawmakers and public health officials now to kind of step back and maybe ask some of these same questions. Again, we're talking about a very slender proportion of those that participate in online gaming, but the ripples can be large and very concerning. Karley Abramson, thanks so much. And again, you can read Karley's report at crcmich.org.
Yeah.
And we want to remind you that if you appreciate the research that the Citizens Research Council does, we are not funded by the government. We are not funded by lobbyists. We take no special interest money. We take donations from citizens just like you. So if you appreciate the notion that facts should drive policy, not politics, perhaps you could visit crcmich.org and make a donation. Until next time, for the Facts Matter podcast and CRC, I'm Guy Gordon. Take care.
The Citizens Research Council of Michigan has been providing lawmakers, academics, the media, philanthropists, business leaders, voters, and all Michiganders with factual, unbiased, independent information on significant issues concerning state and local government organization and finance for over a century. Our research is available to you. Go online at crcmich.org and on all the social media platforms, Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and download our research. Check out our numerous papers and blogs and listen to our podcasts. And while you're there, please consider supporting our research with a donation. This has been a Facts Matter podcast, a presentation of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan.